everybody, welcome back. As you've seen from the title, I wanted to give some recommendations for Women's History Month. So a lot of these books center womanhood and feminism. Actually, a lot of these are texts that I've had to study in my degree. Part of my degree is in women's studies, so it was just really fitting for this month. And I've discovered authors that I'm going to continue to read outside of the degree, and so I just wanted to give some recommendations that I think are really interesting and important for this month to celebrate women, but also feminism. So yeah, before I get into those, I'm just gonna talk about 3 books that are on my TBR that I think are relevant to the themes that I'm going to talk about in my recommendations. They're actually all French books, which I thought was really funny. The first one is Chéri and la fin de Chéri by Colette. This book just talks about sexuality, and when it came out, it caused a bit of an uproar because it came out at a time when people didn't expect women to have sexual relations. And it's a book that sounds really interesting and right up my alley. It is a classic. The second one I don't have with me, but it's essentially the same type of thing. It's Bonjour, Tristesse by Françoise Sagan. It caused the same uproar. She wrote it, I think, when she was 16, and people were shocked that girls think about sex. It really scared people. So I really want to read that one. I've heard great things. And then the final one is Mémoires, jeune, fille, rangée by Simone de Beauvoir. This is her memoir, and Simone de Beauvoir was a very popular French philosopher who brought a lot of really famous ideas around female sex. Her most popular feminist text is The Second Sexe, Deuxième, Sexe. Actually, that gives me a perfect segue to talk about Deuxième, Sexe. It's not as fitting today. It's not that it's dated, but the ideas, they were revolutionary at that time, and they're a little more common now. And it's also a more convoluted text, but if you're interested in feminism, I would read it because it's really interesting. I remember having to study it in high school, and I really enjoyed her writing in that and the ideas present in the text, but it's not a text that I think is as fitting to study now because it's very white feminism. Okay, let's move on to the first recommendation. I guess my favorite author that I discovered in my degree is Audre Lorde. Absolutely love her as an author and the ways that she talks about feminism, queerness, being a black woman. And the book that I want to recommend is The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. I read a few passages from the whole collection, but I studied the main essay for one class, and it brings forward the ideas of intersectionality. Specifically, she kind of talks about the hypocrisy in mainstream feminism that women are fighting for equality but then excluding black queer voices from their activism. It's a really important text. I think it's a text that anyone should read. Audre Lorde just writes very clearly, and it's really impactful. Would really recommend getting into any of her works. Her essays are great, but she was also more known for her poetry, and there is one poem that I would really recommend, which I think is really fitting in these times. It's called A Litany for Survival. If you type it on Google, you can find it. It's going to be the first link. It's free to read, and it will probably take you 5 minutes. But in that one, she talks about resistance, and it speaks to the experiences of people who live on the margins of society, people who are continuously silenced, exploited, and who live in fear because of the violence that they face. That poem is just insanely relevant to what is happening right now politically around the world, and it gives you a taste for her poetry as well, which I think is one of the rare poetry that I don't have to really sit down and analyze. It's very digestible and clear, straightforward, and it's very politically, socially engaging. So would really recommend getting into any of Lorde's work, but those were the 2 that I wanted to really talk about. Another poetry collection that I really enjoyed and that I've read several poems from for my degree is A Place Called No Homeland by Thom. Thom is a Chinese-Canadian trans woman. She talks about being a trans woman, specifically the violence that this community faces. Her poetry is really lyrical and beautiful, but it's still very digestible. just like Lorde's. I find that for poetry, I have trouble just reading it for pleasure. I really need to sit down and analyze it, but both of these, I didn't have to spend as much time trying to understand what was going on. It's very clear, but it's not simplistic. It's just that it's very clear what they're trying to talk about. This poetry collection is insanely moving. I really love a lot of her work. I've had to read a lot of her essays, but I think that this poetry collection is just so beautiful, and I really wanted to recommend it, especially because I don't think she's as well known. And once again, it's pretty relevant to what's going on, especially in the US right now. Her poems talk about identity, racism, belonging. From the title itself, I mean, you get that it really presents the idea of not being allowed to have a homeland, to have a safe space because of who she is. Really beautiful. Next, I wanted to recommend a really popular essay. It's Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. A lot of people have had to read this essay, but I know that it's very white feminism and what it talks about. It just talks to that specific experience, but it is extremely popular for a reason. It was really impactful at the time. It's a good representation historically of the exclusion of women from academia. There's a lot of passages from this essay that I'm sure you've heard. Specifically, I think one of the most popular might be when she talks about what it would be like to be Shakespeare's sister, but it also just really criticizes prestigious universities like Oxford and Cambridge and how much they excluded women then, which is pretty funny because I do think that she gave this speech in Cambridge, but overall her argument is that women need a place of their own and money of their own to be able to write like men do, because a lot of the work focuses on what it's like to write fiction as a woman, and she was really making the argument that women needed safe spaces to do that. So very white feminism, but still a historically important text. Next up, this is an academic article, but it is not convoluted in the way that a lot of academic articles are. It's called Speaking in Tongues, A Letter to Third World Women Writers. It's by Gloria Anzaldúa, and she writes this letter talking about language and how it is both a tool of oppression, but also can be a tool of resistance, emancipation. It's a very moving text if you've ever thought of writing. She really urges women, especially women of color, to continue to use their dialects, to continue to use the specific discourse to where they come from as an act of resistance against erasure. It's just a very beautiful argument that she makes, and I really enjoyed reading this essay, and her writing itself reads really smooth. It's very enjoyable to read. Okay, next up I've got the essay A Site of Memory by Toni Morrison. This is the only text by Toni Morrison that I've read, and I wanted to read her works before having to read that for class. In it, she talks about how being a Black woman writer who talks about political issues like slavery, she has to fill in the gaps that historical archives don't mention, specifically the absence of personal experiences. It's very relevant to her book Beloved. I will link an interview where she talks about Beloved because I think that interview is really great. But I think if you've ever been interested in reading, or if you have before, it's just a very, very intellectual essay. It brings a lot of concerns forward from just erasing parts of history, which again is happening as we speak. And she, like Anzaldúa, really urges people to continue to write fiction specifically, to be able to continue to represent experiences, especially in the face of discrimination and oppression. The next book I have is Kim Jiyoung, born 1982, by Nam-joo. This was really popular a few years back, and honestly I think I read it in 2020 or 2021, but I remember after finishing it thinking everyone should read this book, and I still stand by that. We follow this woman in South Korea throughout her whole life, specifically instances in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood where she faces sexism and oppression from the patriarchy. It's very accurate because it brings a lot of historical, political, and legal facts, which just really show that what the author is talking about is true. But I think what's unfortunately great about this book is that in being extremely specific about the experiences in South Korea, it's very universal. And if you are a woman who has faced sexism, continues to face it every day, this book just represents that reality extremely well. So as a woman, you kind of feel seen, and I think that men should read it because I've heard the argument that feminism is not as useful anymore because women have rights now and we don't face discrimination. But I think that this book just really shows the subtleties of what it's like to be a woman in patriarchal societies. And then the final book is not as feminist, I guess, in themes, but I wanted to talk about it because I just finished rereading it, but also because I think that it represents womanhood very, very well. It's My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. Only read the first book, and I started watching the show, and I really wanted to give credit to the show as well because the show is really good. So I would recommend watching the show as well. But yeah, not as feminist in what it talks about. There's obviously a lot of discrimination that the girls face and violence that women face from just, being women. But I think what this book does really well is just represents what it's like to be a girl, a young girl, having a really close friend. And I think it's so interesting because if you don't know, Elena Ferrante is not a real name, it's a pseudonym, and people have been assuming that she's a man, which I think is insane to say that, but apparently she was a man because her writing is not woman-like. Anyway, it's a really, really great book. And if you wanted something more subtle, if you want something that's just a great piece of literature, would highly recommend My Brilliant Friend. I just urge you to pick a book up written by a woman. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this recommendation video. I haven't filmed one of those in a really long time. I hope there is one book in there that sounds interesting, and I will see you very soon.